The ducks moved like a single silken banner of white and gray across the green water. 60 of them, their passage the only sound in a world that had gone brittle and silent with heat. Beyond the shimmering emerald of Alara's flooded field, the world was the color of dust and old bones. The corn in every other field stood in scorched, rattling rows. The creek bed was a scar of cracked mud and thirsty stones. But here, in the sump, water lapped at the stems of a strange, tasseling grain, and the air was thick with the scent of life. Silas Croft stood on the dry bank, his polished boots filmed with the fine powder of what used to be a road. His face, usually ruddy with confidence, was tight with a frustration he could not conceal. "It's a fluke, Alara, a trick of the landscape. This pocket of wet will be gone by next week, and then what? You'll have a field of mud and 60 useless birds. I am offering you a fair price for the land, a generous one, considering." Alara said nothing. She watched a large drake, one Finn had named the General for his officious bearing, dip his head and come up with something wriggling. She knew the arithmetic of her situation down to the last grain. She knew the arithmetic of the town's situation too. That was the heavier weight. Croft mistook her silence for weakness, as he always had. "A woman alone can't manage a place like this, not in a drought. Be sensible. Sell to me. I'll see you settled somewhere respectable." The ducks paddled on, serene and unbothered, their webbed feet churning the water, their bills sifting the rich mud. They were the answer, but it was an answer he could not yet hear. 1 year earlier, the sump had been a joke. It was 10 acres of bottomland that had belonged to her father, a piece of ground so perpetually waterlogged that it soured every crop he ever tried to plant in it. After he passed, leaving her with little more than debts and the town's pity, the sump was all that remained. Everyone told her to sell it for whatever she could get. "You can't fight water, girl," said Miller Hayes, shaking his head as she signed the papers that cleared the last of the debt and left her with the deed. "That land's got a curse on it." Silas Croft had offered her a pittance for it then, too, speaking of his grand plans to one day bring in steam dredges and drain it properly, to make it productive. His condescension was a smooth, polished stone in his voice. She had refused, and the town had shaken its head at her foolish pride. A young woman alone, with no family to back her, clinging to a swamp. It was a sad story they all thought they knew the ending to. But Alara had watched that land her whole life. She had seen how the water held there, even in the dry spells. She had seen the wild things that thrived in its boggy corners. While others saw a failed cornfield, she saw a basin, a bowl, a place that wanted to hold what the rest of the valley shed. And she had remembered the words of Old Man Hemlock, who lived on the far ridge and kept to himself. A man who had come from a place where water was not an enemy. "The land tells you what it wants to be," he had told her once when she was a child, watching him tend his terraced garden. "A wise farmer listens." So she listened. The land did not want to be dry. It wanted to be wet. The problem wasn't the water. The problem was the corn. She had been trying to grow the wrong thing. The ducks arrived on a flatbed wagon in a teetering tower of wooden crates, their collective quacking a frantic, indignant chorus that announced their presence long before the wagon crested the hill. 60 of them, a breed the seller had called Aylesbury's, large and white with pale, fleshy bills. They were bred for meat, he'd said, but she cared more about their nature. They were water birds. They were foragers. They were, in her mind, 60 small feathered farmers who would work for feed. Miller Hayes stopped his own wagon on the road, staring. "What in God's name are you doing with those, Alara? You'll never get them to roost. They'll foul what little good ground you have and wander off." She just smiled and paid the driver the last of her saved money. The arithmetic had been tight. 60 ducks, a small sack of strange-looking seed, and enough left over for flour and salt to last until something changed. It was a gamble stacked so high it looked like madness. When she opened the crates, the ducks spilled out, a clumsy, stumbling flood of white. They looked around, blinked in the sun, and then, as one, they sensed the water. They half ran, half waddled, a jubilant, quacking mob, and hit the flooded parts of the sump with a series of ecstatic splashes. They dove, they drank, they beat their wings against the surface, sending up glittering spray. They were home. That evening, Old Man Hemlock walked down from his ridge, drawn by the commotion. He was a small, weathered man with eyes that had seen other landscapes. He watched the ducks for a long time, a slow smile creasing his face. "They fit," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. Ilara showed him the sack of seed she'd bought from a catalog, grains that were short and pearly. He picked one up, rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "Rice," he murmured, his accent softening the word. "A hungry grain. But you have the water for it, and you have the tillers." He nodded toward the ducks, who were already busy, their bills sifting through the mud, eating snails and larvae and weed roots. He gave her a piece of advice that was worth more than gold. "They will make the soil rich for it, but you must guide the water. Make it a servant, not a master." He showed her how to read the slope of the land, how to plan a shallow dam and a simple wooden sluice gate to control the depth of the flood. He didn't have much, but he had knowledge, and he gave it freely. The land tells you what it wants to be. A wise farmer listens. That night, Ilara sat on her porch and listened to the contented, murmuring sounds of the flock settling in for the night. For the first time, the sump didn't sound like a failure. It sounded like a beginning. The work was methodical, relentless, and wet. Before the sun was fully up, Ilara was in the sump, her boots sinking into the thick, dark mud. She started with the small earth dam Old Man Hemlock had described, hauling rocks from the edge of the property and packing them with clay she dug from the one dry bank. Her hands, already calloused, grew rough as bark. Her back ached with a deep, satisfying burn. She was not fighting the land anymore. She was shaping a partnership with it. The town watched her, what little they could see from the road. They saw a lone woman wrestling with mud and stones, and their pity hardened into a kind of morbid curiosity. They were waiting for the moment she would finally break and sell to Croft. A boy started appearing at the fence line. His name was Finn, a scrawny 10-year-old from a hard-luck family down the road, with hair the color of straw and eyes that missed nothing. He never said much at first. He just watched, mesmerized by the ducks. They were ridiculous and dignified all at once. They marched in lines, followed invisible currents, and argued with a startling ferocity over the ownership of a particularly juicy frog. Ilara didn't shoo him away. One day, she looked up from her work on the sluice gate to find him standing beside her, holding out a plank. He had seen the one she was reaching for. After that, he was there every day. He wasn't much for hauling rocks, but he had a way with the ducks. He gave them names. There was the General, a magnificent drake who puffed his chest out and led the flock on important patrols. There was Patches, a hen with a single gray smudge on her wing. There was a trio of identical, inseparable hens he called the Three Graces. He knew all 60 of them by sight. He talked to them, and they quacked back, following him in a bobbing, weaving parade. He was the flock's chronicler, their gentle commander. His presence lightened the labor. His quiet companionship was a balm against the town's scorn. Together, they built the sluice gate, a simple but effective door of fitted planks that could be raised or lowered to manage the water level. While she worked, the ducks did theirs. They ate pests. They stirred the soil. Their droppings sank into the mud, a slow, steady enrichment that no fertilizer could match. In late spring, when the dam was finished and the water level was stable, Alara and Finn waded out into the main basin. With the water held at a depth of 6 inches, they began to plant. They broadcast the rice seed by hand, casting it out in wide arcs over the placid, duck-tattled water. The seeds sank into the soft, fertilized mud. It was an act of faith, performed in a field of muck, witnessed only by a small boy and a flock of tame giants. She kept the plantings secret, like a coal banked low under ash. Let them think she was just a mad woman with her birds. The truth could wait. By June, the first signs of success were unmistakable, though visible only to those who knew where to look. In the shallow water, a faint green haze appeared, a submerged lawn of new life. The rice had sprouted. Alara would wade out in the mornings, the cool water a balm on her ankles, and run her hands over the tender shoots. They felt like resilient silk. It had worked. The ducks, it turned out, were perfect partners. They swam between the delicate rows, their paddling stirring the water just enough to discourage mosquito larvae, their bills expertly plucking the competing weeds while leaving the tougher rice shoots untouched. They were living cultivators, and they were producing. The hens began to lay, leaving their enormous, pearly white eggs in nests tucked into the reeds along the edge of the sump. Each egg was nearly twice the size of a chicken's, with a yolk the color of a deep sunset. They were too rich, too strange for the town market in Prairie Bend. There, people wanted what they knew: small, pale chicken eggs. So Alara began walking the 6 miles to the next town over, where no one knew her story. She would carry a basket with 24 eggs, carefully packed in straw. The innkeeper there, a woman with a practical eye for value, bought the first basket out of curiosity. The next week, she was waiting for Alara, eager for more. "My customers, they rave about them," she said, weighing an egg in her palm. "Richest thing they've ever tasted." The money was not much, but it was enough. It was proof. Each coin she tied into a kerchief was a quiet rebuttal to the laughter from the road. She kept the arithmetic in her head, a running tally against the coming winter. 24 eggs a week, flour, salt, lamp oil, a new blade for the scythe she would need for the harvest. She was surviving. She was building something. Silas Croft's buggy appeared on the road one afternoon. He didn't get out, just reined in his horse and watched from a distance. He saw a woman in a mud-stained dress, a boy, and a flock of noisy birds. He saw a swamp. He could not see the green shoots beneath the water. He could not see the basket of heavy eggs she had hidden in the cool of the spring house. He could not see the growing confidence in her heart. He shouted across the field, his voice laced with false concern. "Still trying to tame that bog, are you, Alara? You'll wear yourself out for nothing." She did not reply. She just straightened up, wiped a strand of damp hair from her forehead, and met his gaze across the shimmering water. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was content to let the land speak for her in its own time. The stillness of her response unsettled him more than any argument could have. He flicked the reins and his buggy rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving the quiet sounds of the sump to fill the air once more. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, and the world began to shrink. The lush green of early summer faded to a tired olive, then to brittle yellow-brown. The creek that fed the valley slowed to a trickle. The dust from the road coated everything, a fine, gritty shroud. In other fields, the corn leaves curled in on themselves, a posture of surrender. But in the sump, the rice grew, and it was a miracle of engineering, both hers and the land's. The clay base of the basin held the winter and spring rains like a vast, shallow bowl, losing water only to the sun, and Alara managed that loss with the precision of a jeweler. She used the sluice gate to lower the water level inch by inch as the rice stalks grew taller, exposing the roots to air at just the right time, a trick Old Man Hemlock had taught her. The stalks were thick now, a vibrant, defiant green, and the heads of grain were beginning to form, heavy and full. The sump was an island of abundance in a sea of want. The town's mockery had changed its flavor. It was no longer openly derisive. Now it was laced with a grudging, resentful curiosity. Wagons slowed on the road. People would stare at the impossible green, at the flock of fat, healthy ducks paddling in the placid water. They didn't understand what they were seeing, and it made them uneasy. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The whispers started. That the sump was unnatural, that Alara was using some kind of magic, or that the water she was hoarding was being stolen from their own drying wells. Pride is a hard thing to swallow, and it often curdles into suspicion on the way down. Finn heard the whispers in town and reported them to her, his young face troubled. "They say you're cursing them, Alara. They say your wet field is drinking the sky dry." Alara looked out at the rice, which was just beginning to turn from green to gold at the tips. She looked at the general, who was busy chasing a grasshopper near the bank. "What we're doing isn't a curse, Finn. It's just listening." Old Man Hemlock visited again, his walk slower in the oppressive heat. He stood on the edge of the paddy for a long time, not speaking. He broke off a single head of grain, rubbing the nascent kernels in his palm. He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Heavy heads, you listened well." He looked up at the pale, hazy sky, at the sun that was a white fire in the heavens. "A hungry time is coming for this valley," he said, his voice quiet. "Be ready. Hunger changes a town. It makes good people frightened, and frightened people can be cruel." He was not trying to scare her. He was giving her a map of what was to come. That night, after Finn had gone home, Alara did the arithmetic again. Not of money, but of food. She counted the heavying heads of rice, estimated the yield. She counted her flock. She counted the jars she had to store the grain. And then she counted the houses in the valley. The numbers did not align. It was a new kind of math, one that felt heavier than debt, the math of responsibility. By the third week of the drought, the shallow wells in Prairie Bend began to fail. The water came up muddy, then not at all. The pump in the town square, which had never run dry in living memory, required a dozen hard strokes to produce a pathetic gush of brown water before sucking air with a hollow, desperate sound. The corn was a total loss, the stalks turning to tinder in the fields. The kitchen gardens withered. The faces of the townsfolk grew pinched and shadowed, first with worry, then with a quiet, simmering panic. Alara's sump became a focal point for their fear and resentment. Her land was an affront, a lush, watery paradise that seemed to mock their suffering. The fact that her success was built on the very thing they had scorned, the wetness of the land, was a truth too bitter to acknowledge. So they turned to blame instead. The whispers Finn had heard grew into open accusations. Silas Croft, ever watchful for an opportunity, nurtured this resentment. He would stand with the men at the general store, his voice pitched to a tone of grave concern. "It's not natural, holding that much water back," he'd say, shaking his head. "The earth has a balance. When one person dams up the flow, the whole valley pays the price." He was planting a seed of poison, suggesting that Alara's foresight was in fact a kind of theft. One afternoon, Martha Hayes, Miller Hayes's wife, appeared at Alara's fence. Her face, usually open and kind, was a mask of strained pride and desperation. She was one of the women who had offered Alara pitying advice a year ago. Now she stood twisting her apron in her hands, refusing to meet Alara's eyes. "Our well is dry, Alara," she said, her voice brittle. "The children, they're thirsty." It was not a request. It was an accusation wrapped in a plea. Here was the test Old Man Hemlock had spoken of, the fear of a good person. Alara looked past her, toward the Hayes farm, where the fields were brown and broken. She thought of her own thirst, the loneliness that had been her constant companion for a year. She could have answered pride with pride. She could have reminded Martha of her husband's mockery. Instead, she unlatched her gate. "The spring-house pump still draws clear," she said, her voice steady and plain. "It's not much, but it's cool. Bring your buckets." Martha Hayes stared at her, her mouth half open. She had come expecting a fight, a refusal, a moment of gloating triumph from the woman they had all dismissed. The simple, unconditional generosity of the offer disarmed her completely. She nodded, unable to speak, and hurried back toward her farm. An hour later, she returned with her husband, their 2 children trailing behind them, each carrying a bucket. Miller Hayes looked ashamed. He stood stiffly while Alara worked the pump, the handle squeaking in the quiet air, the gush of cold, clear water a shocking sound in the dry world. He did not say thank you. But as he turned to leave, he met her eyes for a moment, and in them she saw the first crack in the town's hard wall of scorn. It was a beginning. The paper was thick and creamy, bearing the embossed letterhead of a grand hotel in the capital city, a place most people in Prairie Bend had only heard of in whispers. The man who delivered it drove a black automobile that chuffed and shuddered to a stop on the road, an alien machine in their horse and wagon world. He was dressed in a crisp city suit, his face pale and sweating in the relentless heat. His name was Monsieur Dubois, and he was the hotel's head chef. He had heard a rumor, a whisper carried by the innkeeper in the next town over, of duck eggs like alabaster, and a strange new grain growing where nothing ought to grow. Curiosity, he explained, was a chef's most important tool. Alara led him to the edge of the patty. Dubois stopped, his jaw slackening. He stared at the field of golden-headed rice, shimmering in the heat, at the flock of 60 huge white ducks floating serenely on the water. He was a man accustomed to wonders of the culinary sort, but this was a wonder of the earth. He looked from the bone-dry hills around them to the impossible oasis of the sump, and he let out a low whistle. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, "it is real." Alara said nothing. She let the place speak for itself. She took him to the spring house and gave him a glass of cold water, which he drank like a man who had just crossed a desert. Then she cracked one of the duck eggs into a bowl. The yolk stood high and proud, a perfect dome of deep orange. Dubois stared at it as if it were a jewel. He dipped a finger in and tasted it. His eyes closed. A slow, beatific smile spread across his face. "Incredible," he said. "The flavor. It is the earth. It is the water." He spent an hour walking the perimeter of the sump, asking questions not of a farmer, but of a fellow artist. He wanted to know about the duck's diet of snails and water weeds, about the minerality of the soil, about the way the sun hit the grain in the late afternoon. He saw her work not as madness, but as a kind of genius. Before he left, he unfolded the piece of paper. It was a contract. He wanted to buy her entire harvest of rice, which he called by its proper name, arborio. He wanted a standing order of 20 dozen duck eggs a week. The price he offered was staggering. It was enough money to buy a proper farm, to hire help, to leave the sump and the scorn of Prairie Bend behind forever. It was a vindication so complete it made her dizzy. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "this is your ticket out of this dust." He waved a hand at the parched landscape. "You are a producer of delicacies. You do not belong here." Finn, who had been listening from the porch steps, looked at her with wide, anxious eyes. This was the moment of choice. She could take the money and run. She could finally have the last laugh at the town that had mocked her. She held the contract in her hands, the thick paper a heavy, tangible promise of a different life. She looked at the chef's expensive automobile, a symbol of a world far from this one. Then she looked at the Hayes farm, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, and she thought of Martha's face when she had offered her water. She thought of the arithmetic of hunger. The contract lay on her kitchen table, a white rectangle of possibility in the dim light. It was a path to escape, but escape felt like a betrayal of the land that had sustained her. The sump had asked only that she listen. It had not asked her to be selfish. The next morning, the tension in the valley finally snapped. Silas Croft arrived, not alone this time, but with 3 of the town's grim-faced councilmen. They stood at her gate like a tribunal. Croft did the talking, his voice oozing a predatory sympathy. "Alara," he began, "the town is in crisis. People are leaving. The council has determined that for the good of the community, all water resources must be shared." It was a legalistic trap. He was trying to use the town's desperation as a weapon to seize control of her land. "My spring is not a public resource, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I have not turned away anyone who has come to me for water for their homes." "For their homes, yes," Croft pressed, sensing an opening. "But your field, this project, is consuming thousands of gallons while our town withers. It is an indulgence we can no longer afford." He turned to the councilman. "She is hoarding the valley's lifeblood for a crop of birdseed." The lie was slick and ugly. He knew, as she did, that the sump's water was self-contained, a capture of runoff, not a drain on the aquifer. He was counting on their ignorance and their fear. "How many birds do you have now, Alara?" Croft asked suddenly, his eyes sharp. 60, isn't it? A lot of mouths to feed." The question was a mistake. It was too specific. How would he know the count of her flock unless he had been watching, spying on her from the road, counting, calculating, waiting for his moment? She saw it all then, his patient, circling greed. He did not want the water for the town. He wanted the land for himself, and he was willing to burn down the town's goodwill to get it. This was the moment. Her anger was a cold, clear thing, but she did not let it show. She looked past Croft, at the tired, frightened faces of the councilmen, men she had known her whole life. She saw Miller Hayes standing behind them, his face a study in conflict. She took a breath. "The rice will be ready to harvest in 1 week," she said, her voice carrying in the still, hot air. "I have been offered a great deal of money for it by a chef in the city." She saw a flicker of triumph in Croft's eyes. He thought she was about to abandon them. "But it is this valley's grain, grown in this valley's soil. It will not go to the city while my neighbors are hungry." She looked directly at Miller Hayes. "I will sell the entire harvest here, in Prairie Bend. 1 sack for every family, at a price that is fair, enough to see you through the winter. And I will share the water from my spring for your homes and your stock, as I have been doing. But the sump belongs to me." It was not a plea. It was a declaration. She was not asking for their permission. She was offering them a future. A silence fell, thick and heavy. Croft's face darkened with rage. He had lost control of the narrative. He had tried to paint her as a greedy hoarder, and she had answered with radical generosity. The councilmen were stunned into silence. They looked at each other, then at Silas Croft, whose carefully constructed mask of civic concern had crumbled into undisguised fury. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "The land is a public nuisance. She has no right." "She has the deed, Silas," Miller Hayes said, his voice rough but clear. He stepped forward, putting himself between Croft and the gate. "And she has offered us a better deal than you ever have." That was it. The tide had turned. The other men murmured their assent, their faces transformed from suspicion to a kind of dawning hope. They were hungry, and she was offering bread. Croft was offering only rules and resentment. Defeated, Croft turned and stormed back to his buggy, the dust rising around his feet like a manifestation of his own sour anger. He had been outwitted, not by clever legal arguments, but by a simple, powerful act of community. The harvest a week later was not a solitary affair. It was a town gathering. Miller Hayes arrived at dawn with his 2 grown sons, their scythes on their shoulders. Martha Hayes and 3 other women came with baskets and twine. Even old man Hemlock came down from his ridge, a small, sharp sickle in his hand, his eyes bright. And Finn was there, of course, directing the ducks to a separate enclosure, explaining to them with great seriousness that their work was done for the season and they deserved a rest. They worked all day under the hot sun, a quiet army of neighbors moving through the golden stalks. The sound of the scythes was a rhythmic whisper, a song of abundance. They cut the rice, bundled it, and carried it to the dry ground to be threshed on canvas sheets. Ilara worked alongside them, no longer the town's strange outcast, but the center of its survival. They did not speak of the past months of mockery. The shared labor was its own apology, its own reconciliation. By evening, a small mountain of pale, heavy grain sat beside the sump. Ilara stood before the assembled townsfolk, a tin cup in her hand to be used as a measure. One by one, the families came forward, placing their coins in a wooden box, the fair price she had named, a price that respected both her labor and their need. She filled their sacks and barrels, and with every scoop, she felt the weight of her loneliness lifting. She was not one person alone anymore. That night, the whole town ate. They cooked the rice with the last of their garden vegetables and, in a gesture of astonishing trust, with ducks that Ilara had culled from her flock. The feast was held in the open, in the dusty town square, and the light from the lanterns cast a warm, gentle glow. There was a quiet joy in the air, the deep, resonant satisfaction of a community that had pulled itself back from the brink. Monsieur Dubois' contract still lay on her table, but it no longer looked like an escape. It looked like a possibility for the future, a bridge between her valley and the wider world, one she would cross on her own terms. She had proven them all wrong, but there was no gloat in her victory. Her vindication was in the faces of the children eating their fill, in the quiet nod of respect from Miller Hayes, in the shared warmth of a town that had learned to see. The land had told her what it wanted to be, and she had listened. And in listening, she had taught the whole valley a new language, the language of water, of patience, and of a strange web-footed grace. The sump was no longer a curse, it was a promise, shimmering and green under the rising moon.